Good morning. I actually trained as an economist, and listening to Dr. Pollitt, I realize why I don't work as an economist, because that's what an economist sounds like. You're going to hear someone who doesn't sound like an economist right now. You're going to hear someone who sounds like a technologist. So what do I say to a room full of people almost certainly smarter than me? Me, a failed economist. Well, I'd like to tell a very, very simple story. I'd like to tell a story about how software is changing the nature of what companies themselves are. Just at the basic level in which companies interact with their customers, software is beginning to change those dynamics, and it's beginning to create new companies. And I'd like to talk about that, and I'd like to explain how that applies to how I'm thinking about software at Leonteq, and how the great companies that Dr. Pollitt was talking about, what these really successful businesses are, how they're using software today. I joined Leonteq because of that good-looking guy over there, and because I think that there is a particular definition of what a great company will be in the coming years, and it's got something to do with a combination of software and this core expertise. And I think that Leonteq has that, and that's why I'm working here. And I'd like to share with you some of my thinking, and hopefully you'll agree. So I would just like to warn you, I'm not very good at slides, so this could all go terribly wrong. Let's hope it's, oh, there we go. So one of the things, I'm a financial services person. The majority of my career has been in financial services, retail banking, commercial banking. I've spent quite a bit of time in private equity and venture capital, but I'm not a structured products expert like you all. And so as I've begun to learn about structured products, and my colleagues have been very generous in educating this slow technologist, the incredible thing about structured products is volatility itself has become a product. Of course, you all know this. But making that really clear to me, just understanding the productization of change was fascinating for me. And of course, at the core of the structured product is the idea of the option, where just having a choice creates value itself. So of course, this is all absolutely obvious for you, because this is how you invest. But the fascinating thing for me was how software companies, in some way, are beginning to reflect this behavior, and how software companies are making software is beginning to show this kind of behavior, that is, that volatility itself is driving why software companies are required to enable traditional companies to respond to the volatility and change in their market. It goes even deeper. I'll also show how in some ways just the mere ability to be able to make alternative choices is actually driving the value of software itself. And so I've been fascinated over the last month and a half, which is how long I've been at Leonteq. And if this speech goes well, hopefully longer. If it doesn't, maybe it ends here. But I've been fascinated at the similarities between these two. And so I'd like to talk a little bit more about that in some detail. So, I know this guy, CIO of a major airline, a low-cost airline in the United States. This very, very famous quote. Has anyone heard this quote before? We're not a software company. We're not an airline, we're a software company with wings. Very, very big on the West Coast, by the way. Normally, when I do presentations, or in the past when I've done presentations, I normally share the stage with 25-year-olds worth about $5 billion. So I hope your fund does extremely well, Dr. Pollitt. But this is a fascinating thing. Why do you think an airline would position itself in that way? Any ideas? Remember, you're smarter than me. Any ideas why an airline would think of itself as essentially a software company? Well, let's think in terms of what the commodity is that we're dealing with here. What is the commodity? The commodity is a plane. So my ex-employer, GE, we used to make engines for planes. And by the way, the majority of the airplanes in public fleets in the world are financed by GE. So it's a commodity. Airbus and Boeing, they make the planes. There are improvements, naturally. But essentially, one plane lasts quite a long time, and so there's not a huge amount of variance, really, in that particular product. So how do you differentiate yourself? Well, there's some service. You can implement great service on the flight. What else can you do? Well, something else you can do is you can make sure that the planes arrive and leave on time. Anyone who's ever flown on a low-cost airline in the United Kingdom knows this is something you value. So how do you do that? How do you manage that? Well, it's scheduling software. But it's not just that. Have you ever noticed sometimes, depending on the airline that you fly in, when you land, and this is someone I used to literally travel for a living, when you land, they've literally chosen the furthest gate from baggage pickup. You notice that? It's not an accident, it's cheaper. A good airline has software that tells them and is allowed to plan ahead which is the cheapest gate. Everyone has planes, not everyone has the software that picks the cheap gate. Not everyone else has the software that dynamically adjusts the price based on seasonality, etc., so that you get the maximum amount of demand. Everyone has planes. Not everyone has the software. This brings an interesting theme that our chairman raised earlier, which is it's about advice. And I'm going to come back to this again and again. For a company like an airline, where do they go? Because the funny thing is what they can do is they can add software which drives their efficiency, it lowers their operating costs, it increases customer service or perception of customer service. They can do all of that. But it's still a commodity business. The great businesses that we will see in the future will be great businesses based on service and advice. And what you will find is that those systems, those businesses that are essentially based on the operation of these assets increasingly become more and more challenged. And I'll give you a good example of that. So I want, as I exit from this slide, I want you to just give some thought to how are the companies that you represent, software companies. And the one question that is obviously begged is, how does your ability as advisors, how does that correlate with this idea of software beginning to structure how companies operate? Well, hopefully we'll get into that in a couple of minutes. So this is interesting. Has anyone here bought a car recently? Come on, tell me. Who's bought a car? My wife wants to buy a new car. We like the Volvo, because that's the kind of family we are. I assume you guys are Ferraris and Porsches. Seriously, who's bought a car? Someone must have bought a car. My whole story breaks down. Thank you. Thank you for someone saving me. Okay. Why did you buy a car? That was a dumb thing to do. You shouldn't have put up your hand. They're right. It's all well, exactly. It's all about fashion, and we'll definitely get back to this. So there's a really fascinating thing in the U.S. and in Zurich. You don't have to buy a car because there's a service, and of course in Switzerland it's mobility. But in the U.S. they have this thing called Zipcar. So what does Zipcar do? Zipcar basically says you don't have to buy a car. What you do is you have an app, and on that app you find where the nearest car is. And you walk up to the car, and you wave your phone in front of it, and it opens. And you drive, and then you abandon it somewhere, lock the car, and walk away. And you're done. How much does it cost you? Well, it costs you a hell of a lot less than buying a car. What do you think this does to a commodity business, essentially a very vertically integrated business like the car manufacturing business, BMW, Audi, etc.? What do you think it does? Well, the odd thing is that as a car business, what BMW, Audi, etc., Volkswagen, what they want to do is they want to create differentiated products, right? But when people start to use these services, how much do you think they care about the color of the upholstery? Right? How long did you spend choosing the color of your upholstery? You know? A couple of minutes, at least. But the funny thing is what the software has done is the software basically says, I'm actually interested in the service. So all of a sudden, these areas of major investment in, for instance, the car business, are increasingly being eroded for a large part of the market, not for all. There's a 1%. It's not 1% at the moment, it's far greater, but it will be 1%. There is a small slice of every market that is looking for major customization, wants something special, doesn't want to capture or travel in a vehicle that is shared by other people. Germaphobes, like our friend Mr. Trump. So, the interesting thing about this mobility and about services like Zipcar is essentially what they've done is they've taken the commodity component that is produced by the car manufacturer, and what they've done is they've made it easier for people to access those resources without having to buy a car. Now, what does that do? Ironically, what it does is it actually does drive the demand for vehicles. For those of you that read the Financial Times, you will have seen a couple of weeks ago, there was an article which showed that on a seasonally adjusted basis, car sales in the UK were higher than ever. That may have something to do with the train strikes, but that's another issue. So, but the interesting thing is that what's happening here, though, is not only is the car market now being driven by this kind of demand, what car companies invest in, how much they invest in the top-end vehicles, the kind of revenues they're expecting from the top end begins to change because what's happening is the market has grown because it's essentially been opened by software. People who never had access to a car before now have access to a car without having to acquire the debt, etc., associated with getting the car if they can't pay for it by cash. But what are we also seeing? What we're also seeing is that every single vehicle manufacturer now of any size, of course, has its own financing capability. Why? Well, because the fundamental problem, the competitive landscape now is being able to access these resources. And what software is doing, as Ellen said, is beginning to break down barriers. Software is essentially beginning to democratize access to resources. And what does it do to companies when that happens? Well, here's the thing. Modern software breaks down barriers. How many of you have bought software or worked in companies where there has been a massive software program? Yeah? Well, there we go. We've got one guy. Come on. Okay. By the way, you all have. Maybe people protected you from the knowledge. Okay? But you've all been there. Why do people buy from big-name brands? Why do they do that? Why do you buy from an IBM or an Oracle or these big companies? Because the funny thing is increasingly what we're finding is the software that we pay for, the database software that your trading systems runs on, the applications and the libraries that your trading and valuation systems use. These things are open source. They're available online. So where do these big companies fit in? Why do you pay for them? There's always 1%. In just the same way that there is, in the future, going to be 1% who wants to absolutely, positively have rose-pink car upholstery. There will be a 1% that absolutely, positively needs to be able to phone the CEO of IBM when things go badly wrong. But now we're beginning to see the emergence of an additional theme, which is that of advice. When you purchase software from these big names, in actual fact, what you're doing is you're purchasing the support and the advice that comes with it. The actual value in the actual asset itself, the database, etc., is beginning to approach almost zero. There's fantastic technology that you can get out there for free. So where's the value of the software? Well, in the previous example, the value of software came by virtue of beginning to restructure the value chain itself. The value of the software in this case is that it begins to create a focus or an opportunity or perhaps a need for companies to not only have the software capability, but also the advice that goes with it. And this is a really important theme that we see in the great companies that will succeed. And if you look at the great companies or the fast-growing companies on the West Coast and the startups and the financial services space, etc., you can see from a venture capital point of view, there's a great deal of pressure on companies that are essentially just making a play on the basis of how cool our gadgets are. So going forward, the market, and going forward, large companies, there will always be the 1% that want something truly special. But that truly special thing that people are going to be buying in the future is always going to be matched with advice. Let me give you a counterexample here. Who likes task applications? Yeah, there we go. What task application do you use? What's the flavor of the month? Wunderlist, yeah, good one, okay. Anyone else? How about Evernote? Anyone use Evernote? No? Come on. Yeah, there we go. One of my colleagues saving me here. Task applications are cool. I like task applications. I'm not ashamed to say I have a bit of a task application problem. Every single task application available on the Apple iStore I have bought. I'm not going to pretend that that is not the case, okay? Every single one. What's the price of a task application on the Apple Store? Not a lot. So essentially that threshold above which you pass away from the impulse purchase, right, is of course far away. So essentially a lot of these things are impulse purchases. But how does this software make money? It makes money with premium features and things like that, right? That's how they make money. Some of them with adverts, although the advertising model is beginning to be less successful. But it's through premium features. How do you get to use the premium features? Well, you have to use the software for a little period of time, right? You have to use the software for a bit, and then you decide, I absolutely have to have the ability for this task application to be sorted according to, city. These are the premium features. So how do you do that? Well, you have to use it for some period of time. Now, what happens, though, is when you move to a new task application, there's one question that I ask, I'm sure you do too, which is, how do I get the tasks that I have in the previous application into the new task application? Anyone had that problem? I have like 500 tasks in this thing, and now what, I have to write it in again? So how do I get it in? But it doesn't stop there, right? Because you paid $1 for the software. You know that you're going to move again, right? You're fickle. Because you're a software consumer. You're fickle. You're going to move again. So question 1 is, how do I get my data in? Question 2 is what? How do I get the data out? So the funny thing that we're beginning to see with this kind of software, pure commodity software, no advice, okay? Seriously, you don't need to be Milton Friedman to know how to organize your tasks. Not a lot of advice. There's not a lot of value over and above just the basic software. So what's happening with software like this is the value of the software is being driven by your ability to stop using it. Think about that for a second. Let me give you an example. I'm scanning through the Apple Store, and I'm looking for the latest task app because I have this problem that we discussed. I find something. I have a look at it. Maybe it's $1. Maybe I spend $1. Maybe it's free. I download it. I have a look at the thing. I start looking about how I can import the tasks. But then I realize, as part of this basic research that I'm doing in the application, that I can't get the tasks out. What do I do with the app? I delete it straight away. There's no point. Because my fundamental thinking about software is I'm going to move. Right? That's what happens when you have software that is not tied to expert advice. It's a race to the bottom. Doesn't mean to say you can't make money. But we're talking, bear in mind, a lot of my career is spent in real banking. That's retail banking, okay? Where the margins are extremely small. It's the same thing. You've got such small margins in this space, right? And so this is why software and advice begin to come together. But what role does the software play in the advice? Well, in my view, going forward, what we're talking about is we're talking about organizations being able to be highly effective at translating their expertise into software. Why? Because we want to translate our expertise into software so that the experts that we have can create new expertise. Because the expertise of a year ago, 5 years ago, becomes the commodity of tomorrow. We know this. It happens in advice. Just like it's happening in software. It happens to happen in software about 1 million times faster, but it happens nonetheless. So what we have to do is we have to combine, we have to create a capability as companies to be able to synthesize our experience into software. Now, for those of you that have ever been part of large corporate technology programs or been at the blunt end of these large technology programs, what you will find is that they take a long time, right? Who's ever been involved or seen the implementation of something like SAP or something, you know? I mean, it's like a generational project, you know? You do it so you can pass it on to your children. This world is not fit for the future. If you have consumers that are beginning to acquire new products, new assets, making choices at the kind of rate that I spoke about with the task software, don't think that it doesn't come to you all. Don't think that it doesn't start to structure the markets that you're in. Works for task software, it works for the automotive area. Works for structured products too. So what is it? What is it that makes a great company? A great company is able to synthesize expertise at high velocity, be continually updating its software, continually capturing expertise in the software, so that the advice, that 1% edge that you purchase is worth what you pay for it. And that's what the great companies, increasingly as we see a shift towards services, increasingly as we begin to see some compression of commodity value chains, that's where the great company is going to be. And so, that's what Leonteq is going to be doing. What we want to do is we want to translate the incredible expertise that exists in our company. The expertise that initially made me want to join Leonteq. Expertise in structured products, but also expertise in software. We want to translate that expertise into software at high velocity, creating a far more responsive platform. Responsive to two things. Responsive to the expertise in our company itself, but also responsive to the requirements of our customers and our users. Because, by the way, if you happen to be, the same principle applies, even if you are providing a high-value 1% advice platform, even in that world, you're still competing in some way with users like you all who happen to download and use on a daily basis the Facebook app, the WhatsApp app, etc., etc. These applications are updated how many times a day? Check your phones. They're updated at least a week, every week. So we have to be responsive too. The responsiveness is about increasing customer intimacy. It's about making it easier for you to get at and see the advice. Because we're not selling a task app. There is no little list of, dude, how hard can it be? It's a checkbox. Come on. Right? And so this is the fundamental challenge that Leonteq will surmount in 2017. Thank you. You stay?
Yeah. Thank you, Justin. Any questions to this presentation? Well, let me start off then, Justin. Given we call this a Revolution Day, what's so revolutionary specifically about Leonteq software, the software you are building and intend to build?
Well, I think the truly revolutionary thing about Leonteq, and as I said, that's why I joined, is this matching of these two things that are the components of that great company, right? And that is expertise in creating a unique software platform, but also expertise in the structured product in the market itself. Software on its own, and this is the revolution that software is driving. Software on its own, unfortunately, in the long run is a low-margin business. And I wish there were more venture capitalists in the room so we could have a really good argument about that. But I think by virtue of putting the software and the advice together, I think Leonteq has created this perfect storm, if you like.
Well, generally, technological change is considered to be one of the key challenges for the financial industry, not only interest rates and regulation, also technology. How far behind would you say the industry is in addressing those
financial
needs
services?
And demands? Yeah, financial services.
That's a fascinating question. So the short answer is quite far behind. And I think we all know that. Why? Well, if you log into your internet bank and you have a look at your internet bank website, it looks pretty cool, huh? Still costs a whole bunch for them to process your transactions. If you were competing with a UBS or a Barclays, would you back them in terms of creating a cool front end, or would you back a bunch of 19-year-olds who just happen to access through an API a bank in the background? I know who I'd back. So unfortunately, from a financial services point of view, the financial services industry has a huge amount of catching up to do in order to overcome the technical debt that they have. But there is good news, and this is going to sound crazy. So I'm South African, by the way, so part of my religion is to be controversial. So what is interesting in the financial services space is regulation. Massive amount of regulation, and the regulation's getting deeper and deeper. So when I was at GE Capital, a lot of my time was spent dealing with the implications of Dodd-Frank, SEC regulations, and that kind of thing. And ultimately, it culminated in GE selling GE Capital. They didn't sell it because of me, just to be clear. So the financial services regulatory burden, ironically, is probably going to drive more technology innovation in financial services than anything else in the past. Because if you happen to have a 30,000-person organization, and that 30,000-person organization has 100 different processes distributed across 50 different countries with infrastructure that is different in every single country, how do you manage to implement regulation consistently? How do you do it? It's technology is the only way. And in just the same way that panic around nuclear war created DARPA, which created the internet, I think that there is this panic in financial services right now around regulation and around how do we ensure consistency of application of these regulatory ideas across a very, very large estate. That begins to plug into ideas and technologies around automation, new ways of working, such as agile and things like that. And so I think that although regulation certainly puts a great deal of burden on innovation in financial services and can slow down some movement, I think, ironically, it will actually drive a great deal of innovation in the technology space. Was anyone expecting that answer? Yeah?
Question here in the second row.
First of all, thanks a lot. Very interesting.
Thank you.
My question would be, the 90s have all about being consultancy.
Right.
So what is the new compared to advice?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting thing. I was actually working at IBM right at the end of Lou Gerstner breaking IBM up into the little elephants and also beginning to reposition. That's how old I am, just in case anyone's not clear from the gray hair. And beginning to kind of reposition on a services basis. But the strange thing is that the services were still, in these companies, were still very heavily rooted as an ability to be able to place the assets themselves, right? So we're a services company so that we can drive essentially what our high-margin business is, which is hardware, software, right? And so in the IBM terminology or in the consultant terminology, it's all about selling the tin, right? And the tin happens to be a mainframe or a big server or something like that. And to the extent that the services industries are continuing to grow, what I think is changing is that the services are now beginning to be, to some extent, disconnected from the base commodities, right? So no one talks about buying, or no one should be talking about buying infrastructure today. You can get it as a commodity from Amazon or Azure or someone like that. No one should be talking about purchasing or spending a lot of money on the database software. What you're actually acquiring is you're acquiring someone who knows how to generate insights from around about 100 million data points of real-time market data. Oddly enough, the technology problem is actually easy to solve and is available out there. How you combine the two, which is knowledge of the basic technology ideas as well as the advice and understanding how to access that data, that's, I think, the difference. So there's this disconnection from the commodity, and now the role of advice is far more important and is a far greater component of the value proposition than the technology had been in the past.
I think there was another question. Yeah. It answered your question, yeah. Well, you said earlier that you're usually on stage with 25-year-olds worth several billion.
Much like yourself, Ellen.
Oh, I wish. Any fintech that fascinated you the most recently?
Oh, that's an interesting question. That's very interesting. There is, because I'm on stage, I of course forget the name. There's this fascinating company in the UK, which essentially has created a mobile app where what you are doing is essentially spread betting on a range of different topics, including the movement of stocks and that kind of thing. And what happens is when your bets are correct, you actually get given fiat money inside the app. So what's the business case behind that? Well, pretty soon, you want to convert that into real money. And pretty soon, you start trading off of this platform. What a disruptor. Huh. Fascinating. So it starts off as a game, right? It's a gateway drug. It's a gateway drug to trading.
Fascinating. Finally, as a South African, how does it feel living in Switzerland? Must be also quite a challenge.
Well, South Africa's a lot warmer. So the -14 in Zug this morning was brisk. To say the least. Yes, I'm not bred for the cold, but I must say I loved Zug. Is anyone else from Zug? I loved Zug. I live in the old town. And I'm really very, very pleased to be here.
Well,
having a good time. Thank you.
And we hope you stay for a while. Thank you very much for this fantastic presentation. Justin Arbuckle.
Thank you.